but this time I decided to start with the wings. If you've built one of Classic Airframes Vampire kits before, you'll find that the Venom is much easier in this area, mainly because the main wheel well is built as part of the inside of the plastic wings, so there's no resin part to thin and squeeze between the wing halves. We do have a small piece which mounts the main gear legs and also forms the inboard part of the gear leg cover, but this fits with no further trimming or thinning required. The intake grills are supplied as two small plastic parts for each of the intakes, and these fit quite well. I glued them in place with super glue before installing the intakes into the wings. For securing large parts, I like to use Revell cement with the hypodermic applicator. I run an irregular line along the inside surfaces of both the top and bottom wing first, and then wait for a few seconds before bringing the wing halves together. The parts are then taped and clamped to make sure that we get a nice secure fit. This same process is used for all of the major components on the Classic Airframes Venom kit. The intakes are only installed after the wing halves have set. We can see here that there's a small gap on the outboard edge of the intake, and also a tiny little really seam line along the top. There's a similar line along the bottom as well. We'll take care of that in a couple of steps. You'll also note that the grills are slightly overlapping the outside of the intake. We'll trim that off at the same time as we eliminate the gaps. Meanwhile, in the front office, I've started to test fit the main cockpit components. This is a really important step and can save you a lot of grief further down the track. You'll note that I've just used blue tack, a blob of blue tack, to hold the instrument panel, the sidewalls, and also the rear bulkhead in place. And that way I can test fit the fuselage halves to make sure that all of the main parts fit between without any trimming. In fact, test fitting proved that although most of the parts fitted fine, the instrument panel was a little wide to fit between the fuselage halves without some modification. Rather than trim down the edges of the instrument panel, I decided to cut a groove into the inside of the fuselage halves, and that eliminated the problem of the width of the instrument panel. Although my method of assembly is a little different to that suggested by the instructions, I like to glue the resin sidewalls inside the fuselage before painting and assembling the cockpit. This provides a good reference point for the bulkheads and the instrument panel, and I think it's also easier to paint. Speaking of painting, I like to actually attach the small cockpit sub-assemblies via blue tack to a box, and which makes it easier to keep track of the parts while they're being painted. Some smaller parts will also benefit from being pinned. It will make the bond more secure and hopefully prevent them from being knocked off during construction or after the model is finished. Here I've drilled a hole into the base of the control column and just added a small piece of steel wire to make that bond a bit more secure. Here we can see that the cockpit parts have been sprayed flat black, followed by a light coat of dark grey sprayed at an angle, so that some of the natural shadow areas still retain that black appearance. We also see in this photograph that the instruments are white on the black panel. These are small blobs of micro crystal clear, and once they're dry, they will actually dry as a shiny clear lens for the individual instruments. I use the same method for painting all the silver parts as well. Just stuck with a blob of blue tack and sprayed while they're all in one place. Here we can see the completed sub-assemblies for the cockpit brought together. The detail parts have been picked out with a fine brush, and I've also added some decals of placards from a reheat decal sheet. These add a little more life to this black dark cockpit. I've also deviated slightly from the instructions in gluing the rudder pedals directly to the top of the front wheel well bulge. I found that this permitted me to thread the two spokes of the cockpit floor underneath the rudder pedals, effectively locking them together without requiring glue. This just gave me a little more play when I was ready to glue the cockpit assembly between the fuselage halves. Here we can see the cockpit parts glued into one half of the fuselage. We can also see the engine fan and exhaust assembly glued in place. You might find that you need to trim or adjust the circular fan part in order to get the exhaust to stick out just the right amount from the rear of the fuselage. I found that the fit of the front wheel well was extremely good, and I think this really was helped by not gluing together the cockpit floor and the wheel well part before gluing the cockpit to the fuselage half. It just gave that little bit of a margin for error, a little bit of adjustment space before the two fuselage halves were joined. It is essential to install nose weight into this model. As you can see here, I've installed around 6 small lead fishing sinkers in the nose above the wheel well and behind the instrument panel, and even this was not quite enough to get the model to sit on its nose. Regardless though, it was time to join the fuselage halves. The fit was once again very good, with just a small step at the nose, which I think was more a problem of my making, where the parts interfered with the lead nose weights. I didn't add any further reinforcement to the wing and fuselage join because the surface area that's glued together is so large. There is no step and virtually no gap on the plastic parts, and just a small gap to be dealt with where the resin intake meets the side of the fuselage. The situation under the wing duplicates that above, where the fit of the plastic parts is perfect and there's just a small gap to deal with between the resin and the plastic fuselage. At this stage, you don't want to install the bottom gun cover. The distinctive shape of the Venom quickly emerges at this stage of construction. I assembled the tail booms and horizontal stabilizers as a single sub-assembly before joining them with the fuselage. And now, here is a classic case of do as I say and not as I do. I didn't realize that the separate ailerons supplied in the kit were the large powered ailerons required for the FB.4. This was because I didn't have instructions and I didn't do adequate research before completing the kit. I was therefore in a situation where, with the wing assembled and attached to the fuselage, I had to remove the ailerons. Now, if you follow the instructions, then this will be a much easier task, just cutting this away from the upper wing alone. But I used a razor saw to first separate the edges of the ailerons, and then I used a scriber to deepen the join line between the ailerons and the main part of the wings. Finally, slicing the moulded on ailerons off the wing using a sharp hobby knife.